I know nobody ever likes to think of this, but sometimes you just run out of magic, right? Welcome to Get to the Hook. I am your co-host, Charles Lackey-Baudier.
And I'm your co-host, Eric Colley.
All right, so we're going to get to the hook today, which is, I like to think of it as good news, bad news. And there's a lot of bands we're going to talk about, a lot of artists we're going to talk about, but R.E.M. is the reason that they are the news hook in this hook, because the good news for them is they got into the Songwriters Hall of Fame.
Which is a huge honor for them. They were very excited about that.
Huge honor. And honestly, I don't think enough people look at the Songwriters Hall of Fame. Everyone, like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame gets all the recognition. Really pay some attention to that. There are some incredible artists that I feel like they're getting what they deserve, what they've earned. And I think even for them, being in the Songwriters Hall of Fame is an even bigger, Rock and Roll
because
Hall of
they
Fame.
pride themselves on their songwriting.
Exactly.
Right.
So R.E.M. got in. That's the great news.
And they performed a song at the induction
And they
ceremony.
performed, which I'm sure had R.E.M. fans thinking, look how great this is, that we got everybody back together.
They broke up in 2011, and not just that they've been broken up since 2011. This was the original four members who have not performed together since 2007 when they got in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So other than a Hall of Fame, you're not seeing R.E.M. together.
Right. Everyone's excited to see them.
Right.
Here's the bad news. Because here's what they said. This was on CBS News.
CBS Mornings,
yeah. CBS Mornings. They were talking about this honor and what isn't going to happen.
What would it take to get you guys back together one more time?
A comet. Super glue.
Super glue? It ain't happening is what you're saying. No. Why is that?
It'll never be as good.
That's why it's really not going to happen. The thing is, the four of them like each other. Usually when bands break up,
they sounded...
it's ego clashes, it's this or that. They like each other, they respect each other, but that is the best reason. It wouldn't be as good.
Is it? I know nobody ever likes to think of this, but sometimes you just run out of magic, right? I think some like what I heard from them is, we just don't have what we had before.
And
I mean, at some point they realize,
and they're very comfortable with that. And the thing too is, if they had stayed together this whole time and kept doing new albums, fine. They're very talented. They would be good albums. But because they broke up, if they get back together, that places this weight on it. It's R.E.M. And the audience's mind, you want it to be like 1995 again. And it's not going to be.
It's not 1995. And I think they also realize that even if they could put together something that sounded as good as what they were doing in 1995, it's not 1995. And they know that's not going to sell most likely. So
they don't want to be a nostalgia act. They don't want to...
If you're going to be a nostalgia act, you can just do that by going on tour.
Sure.
But also, who wants to go on tour?
Right.
That's a whole other thing.
And they don't need the money. Of course, they could make a lot of money if they did this, but they don't need it. They don't... R.E.M.'s a band that you believe. That's not a driving motivator for them.
Right.
So, I think sadly, R.E.M. is done. NSYNC, we may be getting back, though. They did the song together, then they got together on Justin's album. There's rumors of a tour coming, so maybe that one. But again, that would be...
And that one would be...
That's nostalgia.
But that would be easier just because you can still have an NSYNC sound that'll probably be somewhat commercially successful. Right. Like if they wanted to do an album, I mean, let's be honest, it would sound a lot like probably some of Justin Timberlake's more recent hits. And that's fine. So that's closer. They could probably get away with that.
Right.
I just don't know if I'll just say they, I'm not going to name any names. I'm not picking out one single member who might feel this way, but maybe they don't really want to share the spotlight. Let's say that.
Possibly.
Yes.
That's, when you have a group that's kind of all singers, they have to trade off who's singing the lead.
Right.
And they kind of know who's going to be doing that. So, so NSYNC, we don't know. R.E.M., we're pretty sure, sadly, it's never going to happen. Although, again, I respect, because now what you think of R.E.M., they will always be that. There's no coming back and ruining it. It's like, they should have just left it like it was. And
there are some acts that have done that.
There are some bands
where you get excited that they got back together, and then they do record something, and you're like, maybe they could have just...
Let's look first.
Let's go down.
Let's talk about the bands who did get back together, and then we'll talk about the ones who never have. One of the most famous to me, because they named their comeback after it, the Eagles.
Yeah,
And this seemed
they acknowledged it.
so unlikely. Their 1994 album called Hell Freezes Over was a direct reference to Don Henley being asked in the early 80s, will the Eagles ever get back together? And he said, when hell freezes over. Well, then it did.
Yeah, and they leaned into it. And
Right.
boy, and by the way, leaned into it. So they got back together, you said it was 94?
So it started, do you remember there was an Eagles tribute album in the 90s? It was a country tribute album. Travis Tritt did a cover of Take It Easy and got the Eagles to appear in the video. And Glenn Frey and Don Henley, who, the Eagles had all hated each other. That was a very bitter band divorce when that happened.
Very famous fight that went down, but I think they were in Long Beach after a concert, and they actually
Right.
got into a physical fight backstage.
It was egos. It was everything out of control. They all went on to solo careers. All of them had hits at some point. But Don Henley and Glenn Frey said that, when they shot this video, you get older, time passes, you get a little nostalgic, and you think, you know what, I did like these guys. We did do something good. What if we got back together?
Let's just do it. We'll record a few songs.
Yeah.
We'll go on a tour and be like, all right, that's great. We had our thing and we dip out the door. They are still touring.
Glenn
right
Frey is
now.
dead now. Has been
Glenn
dead for almost a
Frey,
decade.
R.I.P. is
Yes.
dead.
Randy
And they-
Meisner's dead now. When they got back in '94, that was super exciting. This was one of the new songs they did. They did a live album, and then they did a couple new songs and new studio tracks. This was the lead single. It's called "Get Over It."
Get over it. All this running and crying, get you to fit. Get over it. Get over it.
By the way,
He came back with some energy.
came back with some energy. That also, at that time, was a sound that Don Henley was recording. So it almost sounded kind of like that could have been off of a Don Henley album,
Right.
which may or may not have caused any contention. But that was one of the new songs. So when they were touring, yeah, you'd get that song and you get maybe one other new song, but then you were just getting the hits. And
Yeah. Well, they said later, and so they eventually did record a new album. It took another 13 years after the reunion for Long Road Out of Eden to come out in 2007. Debuted at #1, just as Hell Freezes Over had done, because the Eagles they have the best-selling album in U.S. history,
Yep.
not their greatest hits album. They toured Long Road Out of Eden and did like 5 or 6 of the new songs, and then they were like, oh, people don't want to hear this.
yeah.
So now, they're on their farewell tour right now.
Yeah, well, that's right. This is supposed
Yeah.
to be the
It might be
farewell tour.
because so many of them have died at this point.
Right.
They said, you know what? We know you just want the hits. You want Hotel California and One of These Nights and Best of My Love. That's what you want to hear.
Yep.
That's what we're going to play. So it's funny also. So the famous quote was Don Henley saying, we'll do it when hell freezes over, because that became the album title. Another quote that's I see why they didn't want to lean into this quote. In 1982, just a few years after the breakup, Glenn Frey was asked about a reunion, and he said, I just rule out the possibility of putting the Eagles back together for a, quote, Lost Youth and Greed tour.
Ooh.
And maybe that's what it is.
Wow.
But let's call it what it is.
Yeah, I mean, but that's what, anytime you have a legacy act like that gets, yeah, I mean, maybe it's not so much greed. Well, I guess depends on your definition. I
Yeah.
mean, yes, they have money, but here's my thing about this.
And you want to feel relevant, and you want to play those songs. I mean, those songs are their legacy.
And I feel this applies to, because I hear people say this about the Rolling Stones all the time, right? These guys have been doing it forever. They have money. They don't need it. You're right. You have money. But if someone comes to you and says, even though you have money, someone comes to you and says, I can give you X million dollars if you do X shows with people that you enjoy being around,
Yeah. For an
doing what you
audience
love doing,
loves
why
you.
wouldn't you do it?
And it's
Even
what they
if you
love to
have
do.
the money, why wouldn't you do it?
Well, there was one band that held out on that famously, who finally got back together after 40 years, ABBA.
Yep.
ABBA was, when they broke up in '82, so ABBA was 2 couples. They both went through divorces within 2 years of each other, and they were like, you know what, this does not work anymore. We can't
Sorry.
pretend to be this band.
Tear just came to my eye. I was thinking about A Winner Takes It All.
Oh, that song is so sad. That was their song about the divorces.
Right.
And they were, he wrote it, she's singing it about their divorce. Anyway, they split up because they were like, you know what, there's no point in going on with
Right.
this creatively. 2000, ABBA is offered $1 billion to do 100 shows. $1 billion.
Wait a second.
And they said no. They turned it down.
Also, 100 shows is like, I mean, unless you're Taylor Swift, who's getting together for 100 shows?
Yeah, that's a
Even,
lot.
but although, like I said, $1 billion
$1
is
billion. And the thing is, to go through those divorces by 2000, the 4 of them were cool with each other. Obviously
yeah,
it was,
and they had
They said at the time, they're like, oh, they were like happy divorces is what they called it. Maybe that's the Swedish translation. It's a sort of a weird phrase, but eventually they were like no, it wasn't. It was painful, but they didn't hate
Hate
each
each
other.
other, right?
And so the four of them were close. So that's why when they did their Voyage album just a couple years ago, and now they have
Now they have the
avatars.
Yes, exactly. That
the
they're
digital
living on
ABBA, which
virtually.
is what Kiss is going to be doing. They're a band. Kiss never broke up until this farewell tour, but
They just changed
but
members.
huge reunion for them in '96 when they got the original lineup back up. That's a thing people want too, not just the band. It's if you're a band that's kept going, but there's a certain period you want.
Mhm.
Kiss brought the original two members back. They put the makeup back on. Everybody loved it, and then it fell apart again for the same reasons it did the first
Right,
time.
exactly.
The infighting and the egos and all the issues. Van Halen, remember, got back with David Lee Roth eventually.
Yeah.
Then it fell apart. Then they went back to Sammy Hagar. That fell apart. Went back to David Lee Roth, and that was their final album. You want these things to come back together, but maybe
But there's a reason it
maybe we
didn't work.
don't. Right.
There's a reason it didn't work in the first. I know why the fans wanted to come back together, but for the artists, they get in the room and they're like, I really didn't like
I
it.
remember why we broke up.
Yeah, exactly.
Like Fleetwood Mac, remember when they got back, the classic 70s Rumors era lineup got back together in '97, pulled an Eagles. They did a live album called The Dance. It was, the five of them.
Yeah, and that was at a time, and it was on MTV, I believe,
Right.
when they did that live album, and I think that brought Fleetwood Mac to the forefront for a different generation.
Right. People rediscovered
Yeah.
Rumors and the self-titled album and Tusk and all those. And they toured for a while, and variations of Fleetwood Mac continue to this day. But, there's lawsuits again with Lindsey Buckingham. It fell apart the same way it did in the 70s and 80s. Just certain egos don't go well
Right.
together.
Yeah, sometimes it is better to leave well enough alone.
Right. But Journey did one. Remember, they got back with Steve Perry in '96. They came out with this song, When You Love a Woman.
I know that you love a woman. I see your world inside her.
Sounds like a Journey song.
Sounds like a Journey song.
And they
by the
said-
way, and it was how did that chart? It did
Number
well,
12.
right?
Went to number 12, yeah. It was nominated for a Grammy. And they said when they made this, Trial by Fire was their album. It was their first album together in a decade. And they said, we didn't want to try and chase trends or be the flavor of the month. We were just going to make a Journey record.
Right.
And it was really well received. They had some issues, solo careers. The group Bad English splintered off of Journey.
Right.
Remember that? Steve Perry had a solo career. They come back, the album's successful, and they're like, let's tour. Neil Schon, one of the main songwriters, is like, we're going to tour. Steve Perry's like, well, I have this degenerative bone disease.
Yeah.
Wasn't sure if he wanted to tour or not. And they gave him a year to decide, and he never did. So they're like, we're just going to move on without you. And now,
That's
30 years later,
And they're
Steve
still
Perry's
going.
had lawsuits against the other members. The members have had lawsuits against themselves. It doesn't
a
always
shame.
work.
Doesn't always work. And I think they wanted to. I mean, I do think from what I remember that Steve Perry, it's not so much that he didn't want to tour, but he really did have health
Yeah.
issues. And then after the bone thing, then he had a cancer battle. And yeah, so
Right.
that one didn't work out. Although I do remember when that song came out that I was like, oh yeah, Journey's definitely going to get back together. They're going to tour.
Yeah.
It's going to, because the album was good enough. But, sometimes there are other things other than egos and personalities that step in that kind of derail things.
And they were hitting that point. You were so far removed. You're about a decade removed from Journey's biggest hits at that point. And the music scene was changing very drastically in the late 90s. That people, I think, Journey has continued as a band and put new albums out. Arnel Pineda,
Yeah.
the singer they got famously,
Mhm.
who was in
It
a
was
cover
a
band.
Steve Perry cover.
Right.
Yeah.
And he's been a great singer for them. They still tour and still do well. But then a few years later, people rediscovered Don't Stop Believin'. And
Thank you, Sopranos.
yeah, and Journey's classic hits they were never going to be able to compete with that.
Right. That's when you got to go, all right, we're just going to tour. There's no reason to record anything
Right.
because you're not going to play any of those songs anyway. And you know that those songs they're not going to be commercial successes.
Except
I
for
think-
some people. One group,
Oh.
one act who got back together and got
Okay.
their only number one hit from Reuniting. This is a more recent one. The Jonas Brothers.
They never had a number one hit before?
During their Disney days, they never had a number one hit. They had number one albums. They were huge. And then, of course, split up. Egos got in the way.
Mhm.
Brothers fight the way only brothers can. Went off and got very successful solo careers. I think that helped them as a group is that, Nick Jonas had Jealous. Joe Jonas and DNCE had Cake by the Ocean. So they got
So there
more
wasn't
popular.
like one person who went off and had huge success and everybody else was just sitting at home twiddling their thumbs. Everybody was doing something. So when you come back together, you don't have that dynamic in the room. It's like, oh, we all know we can do it
Right.
on our own, but hey, let's do it together.
And when they did it, they got the only #1 hit any of them ever had. This was the Jonas Brothers, and it's going to be stuck in your head the rest of the day.
Yes, indeed.
Sucker.
Break my typical me, break my typical rules. It's true, I'm a sucker for you. Yeah.
That is a catchy song.
It really is.
And that debuted at #1, and it's like, they are back.
Huh. They did not know that about
Yeah.
the Jonas Brothers. I thought-
Also, oddly, New Edition, when they got back together, had, as a group on the pop charts, their highest charting song. And it's not their most famous song, certainly, but
definitely not. But I loved this album,
Yeah.
and I played it like it was. I think it was probably #2 in my 10-disc.
the old changer, the multi
that was in my
changer.
car.
Right.
Yeah, it was in the trunk. I'd
Yeah,
get
yeah.
out of the trunk and change out the discs and stop. Like Wild's over there, like, what did you guys do?
Yeah.
You had to go in
Producer
your
who
trunk?
was not alive at that time.
Yes, but I loved this album.
Yeah. So yeah, New Edition. Obviously, in '85, Bobby Brown left to go solo, and Bobby Brown was good to go solo, as he told us. Johnny Gill came in. They were still successful. Had "If It Isn't Love," "Can You Stand the Rain?" Like, but then they all went solo.
No, so Johnny Gill went.
Johnny Gill
solo,
had hits.
BBD.
Belle Biv DeVoe dropped Poison. Ralph Tresvant had Sensitivity. Bobby Brown became one of the biggest stars in the world for a couple of years. So when they came back in '96, there was a lot of anticipation for what does New Edition sound like after all the solo success.
Right.
And Home Again was their only #1 album on the Billboard 200.
And this is the only one that has the entire line with Johnny.
Yeah, all 6
and
of them.
Bobby.
That was the weird thing
Right.
too. It's not just, oh, we got back with Bobby Brown. They kept Johnny Gill. So his replacement, they just became
Yeah.
sextet instead of a quintet. But this song hit me off, hit #3, and became New Edition's highest charting song. I wish y'all could see Charles was just
Oh, yeah.
vibing.
Shout out to Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis,
Right.
who produced that, and I love that album. I played
Yeah.
the hell out
And
of
it was very contemporary. It sounded like a
Yeah.
late '90s R&B record. They weren't trying to chase what they had done in the '80s or the early '90s. They stayed contemporary.
Yeah, that one worked.
That one.
And
that's
by the
when it
way,
worked. and
we
they
should
still
say-
tour.
Is working to this day because I think in a couple of weeks or months their Vegas residency starts.
Right.
So shout out.
So it's
going to
nice when
Vegas.
you can become a legacy act, but also have that new chapter to add to it. So it's like, oh, we aren't just this long ago. We're slightly more recent, but still long ago.
But to that point, like yes, they're gonna do this residency, but no one's suggesting that New Edition should get in the studio and record anything. Like
Because they signed a Bad Boy, and all the
They
issues.
did?
Yeah, they did another album. They had a song called "Hot Tonight" came out, and I've forgotten the name of the album. Honestly, it did not do as well.
mhm.
And they're like, okay, maybe the comeback is. But also by that point, we're into the mid 2000s.
Yeah.
And, their heyday was 20 years in the past at that point. Music had definitely changed
Music
again.
changes, trends are different, and
But getting back together in '96 set them up to do this Vegas residency. People knew, oh, they can tour. They still sound good. So,
yes,
because otherwise they could have just faded away and been forgotten.
well, they didn't.
They did not.
Thankfully,
They did not.
Thankfully, not at all.
Other bands, just some that got back together. Blondie got back in the late '90s and still tour. They've stayed together ever since. The Cars finally came back, did one album, and then sadly Rick Ocasek died. The Go-Go's got back together. Smashing Pumpkins, Soundgarden, A Tribe Called Quest got back
Oh,
together finally in
man.
time to do an album.
They
The
did an
album,
album, and then
We Got It From Here. Thank You for Your Service. And Fife Dog sadly died of diabetes before it came out. But what a good way to go out.
yeah,
It had been nearly 20 years since their last album.
and that album was so well received, not just by their fans but by critics, and thankfully they are finally getting in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame this year. That was a rough breakup because that group was so freaking influential.
Yeah.
Like that sound, there was nobody else who was doing it as well as they were on the level they were, and it went on to influence so many other acts. So
Right.
when they broke up, that one hurt. And then,
And I really thought, if nothing else, I thought Q-Tip was going to become a really huge solo star.
well, see, I'm glad you brought that up
Why?
because I think Q-Tip did become a big solo star. Not
He did, but not. I thought he was just going to be massive in the 2000s after they broke up at the end of the 90s.
right,
And
but
his
the thing
voice
was,
is so distinctive.
his voice is so
so-
distinctive, and he did that album. It was
The one with
again,
the Vibrant thing.
yeah,
That I love that song.
it's
I love
a
that
great
song so much.
album. But he was also producing so much, And I guess this is Q-Tip is a good example of what I think goes wrong when, if I had a piece of advice for artists out there, and not that anybody's listening to me or gives a crap what I think, but this is what, as a fan, when a group becomes really, really successful, you can almost, who's the creative wizard behind that group, right? You just want to say to them, that's fine, go do your solo thing, but you don't have to end your group. Go do a solo thing and still stay together.
Phil Collins and Genesis was the perfect. I mean, he eventually did leave, but all through the '80s, he would do a Phil Collins record, do a Genesis record,
right?
Do a Phil Collins record.
Do both. Do both. It's good for the fans, and it's like you don't have to do the exact. Yes, we're gonna hear. It's like when Mick Jagger did his solo stuff for whatever that was worth. A lot of it sounded like they could have been Stones, and same thing for Keith Richards when he did solo stuff. They sounded like Stones, but I mean, they never broke up. They just hated each other.
Yeah.
Didn't record together for a long time.
Well, it's like Aerosmith. They stayed together. They just hated each other. They still do, but
yeah,
but they stayed together for the kids.
Go do your solo thing, but don't trash the whole group because of it.
Well, then you see the Eagles thing. They talked so much trash and then had to come back together. And I mean, nobody cared.
Right.
If you like the music, you don't care if they hate each other or not. But
it's more for them.
Messy.
Like it's more for them. How are you going to be able to come back if you trash someone in the public that hard? Then no, you're not going to have any chance to come back together.
Motley Crue had that issue. Remember, they were so bitter about Vince Neil. Then they got back together. I love. Then do you remember when they did their farewell tour? Like what, 5 years ago or however long ago it was? Do you remember they signed a contract? They said, "Here's a legal contract. We all signed it that we will never tour again." And then they toured again and posted a video of them burning that contract because they were like, "Yeah, just kidding.
We didn't realize how much money there was going to be in this touring thing, so hell with that contract."
Well, I got some respect. One of these last bands I want to talk about, some of the 2000s bands that are now. It's been long enough ago. They're getting back. My Chemical Romance got back together. Fall Out Boy took a 5-year break. Seemed like they were done after 2008. Folie à Deux, their album, and they got back together to record an album called Save Rock and Roll. And I love that they got together in secret. They never announced they were getting back together. They told no one. They said that they went and recorded this album privately because if it sucked, then they just wouldn't release it and nobody would know.
That is so smart. So smart. You avoid all the public pressure. You avoid the fans going like...
The hype. Like, they just like, hey, we have a new record. And people were like, oh, cool. Fall Out Boy's back together. And they got hits again. But yeah, just keep it secret. Which then makes me wonder...
Little advice, NSYNC.
What if some bands did record albums and like, ooh, yeah, the magic's gone and we just don't know?
Well, you remember the Police who talk about hating each other. And the thing I love about the Police is they openly hated each other so much. They all will talk about it and say specific things that other members did that pissed them off. So they were openly hating each other. And then they did come back they were broken up for what, maybe 3 or 4 years.
83 when Synchronicity came out, Every Breath You Take, like they hit a new commercial height.
Right.
And then went on hiatus then. Then in 86, reconvened. Sting had done his solo record, his first solo album. And they're like, let's make a new album. And it did not go well.
No, and people did not like, they basically did a remake of a reboot.
Don't Stand So Close to Me.
And people are like, no.
Yeah. But
they were trying to be more, they tried to make it more modern.
They're like, can the Police still exist? And they tried it and it didn't work. So no album ever came out of it. Then they were like, we're broken up.
We're done.
So so we're going to talk about bands now who never got back together. The Police did eventually in 2007 tour again. And now they say that they're like, yeah, people always thought we hated each other. No, we like each other. They just have a lot of issues, professionally.
We like each other until we actually have to be around each other.
Yeah, they can't. They don't work well together, which is too bad because when they get together, it's so good.
I saw that show at Dodger Stadium.
Oh, I saw it at the Hollywood Bowl, but
excuse me.
Well, no, Dodger Stadium. You got the bigger venue.
Well, but the Bowl is a better sound.
Well, yeah, but the Police did get back together, but I think people wanted to hear them make new music together, and that never happened.
Yeah,
some other artists that kind of got back together. Outkast, people have wanted Outkast to get back together for 20 years now.
Outkast to get, because
they did do a tour together. They headlined Coachella about 10 years ago, did a run of dates, but then that was it.
And then walked away.
And then we got a flute record from Andre.
and then we get a flute record.
And people still want an Outkast.
But I think that Outkast, and they're not going to do it again because now there's too much hype, right? And now everybody wants the magic that it was. And I think they realize that like they've changed. Music has changed. They're not going to come out and do a mumble rap record. They're not going to do.
Yeah, no. Andre said he's like I tried. And I can't. But
Yeah.
I could see them because they don't hate each other. It's that same thing.
Right.
I could see them being like an ABBA kind of thing where 20 years from now, they're like, you know what, we felt like it.
Yeah.
Because clearly
that's
Andre's not doing it for money. If he wanted to do it for money, he would have already done it by now. I don't think Big Boy wants to do it for money. It just
If the mood hits them, they're in the right nostalgic mood, and
Right.
then someone actually makes the offer, they're like, oh, okay.
And if they feel like, yeah, you know what, we have an album we want to make now. Andre just hasn't felt that in 20 years,
Right.
sadly. The Beatles, they never got back together. I think eventually they would have. But then they kind of did posthumously.
Yeah.
'Cause they've released 3 songs since the breakup that were newly made songs.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I count that.
No, I don't count it either. And also, it would have been, even those songs, you can't judge if they had actually stayed together, or they were all alive, and they recorded. It would have been different. It would have been different from this, because those songs are basically things they had recorded before that someone.
Right. John Lennon did those as piano demos. It's interesting that it seems like it would just make sense that eventually they would have done something together, or a show or something.
Yeah.
What's funny is the reason people knew that it absolutely could never happen was when John Lennon died. But I think had John Lennon lived, he would have been the holdout.
Yeah.
I think John would have been like,
Oh, he
I
would have
don't-
been a holdout. No.
Yeah, like John would have been like, not even out of spite, just I think he
I
would
don't
have
wanna
had
go
the
back to
desire
it.
to go and do that.
Yeah.
And the other 3 probably would have. Some other bands that Led Zeppelin, they've done one-off shows twice. Once at Live Aid, once in 2007.
This is one of
for,
my
I'm at
greatest.
Reagan.
This is one of my greatest regrets as a music fan. I gambled that was 2007
7. When
when
they did
right.
one show.
That was the first year that we'd started TMZ, the TV show.
Right.
And I remember when they were getting together for the Atlantic Records show in London. And I have a friend I grew up with, and we loved Led Zeppelin. Like, well, we got to go. And we talked for like 3 weeks leading up to the show. Every day we would look at airfares, we would look at hotels. We were like, all right, we can probably get tickets for this much. And we priced it all out. And we're like, we can do it. We know we can do it. And then we talked ourselves out of it because we said, they're going to go on a tour.
Of course they are.
They're going to go on a tour.
Obviously.
We don't need to fly all the way to London. Blah, blah. Listen, they're going to announce a tour like the week after that show, and it'll be fine. And we're like, yeah, we're golden. And it never happened. And to
Never
this day,
happened.
every time I talk to Brian, who tries to get me to go to some other stupid show, I go, no, you backed out of the Zeppelin show. And so I'm never going to see another concert with you.
Yeah. Talking about keeping a grudge. That's a band you're not
Yeah.
getting back together.
Yeah.
I had a friend when that 2007 show happened with Led Zeppelin. He started a savings account to put money in. He goes, when they tour, and because they're going to, because everybody
Right.
thought they were.
Right.
He's like, I don't care if it's $5,000. I'm going to see.
I
it.
will have the
He
money.
was
set
he
aside.
was saving money. I don't know what he ever eventually did with it.
I was going to say, is that money still?
I don't think he's still saving it, but yeah, he's like, I'm putting money aside for Led Zeppelin tickets.
Yeah,
They still could make so much money if they did it.
Yeah.
I think that ship has long since sailed.
Yeah.
Some other bands that never ever got back together, and I don't think ever will. Unlike the Jonas Brothers or the Bee Gees broke up for a little bit in the early 70s, got back together. Because with brothers, the fighting's more intense because there's the personal family level,
But it's also
your family. You come back together.
Right.
Not in 2 cases, the Kinks and Oasis. Those are 2 sets of brothers in each band that loathe each other
Yeah.
and will never, ever, ever come back together. Because now they're it's a spite war
Yeah.
between Ray and Dave Davis of the Kinks and Noel and Liam Gallagher of Oasis. I honestly don't see them ever getting back together.
Yeah, another bad family situation.
Yeah.
Again, DeBarge.
What-
DeBarge. I'm sorry. I'm getting some personal.
Yeah, what is your issue with
I
DeBarge?
just have my issue with DeBarge is this: and anybody who wants to come at me, if you want to say that DeBarge is not an incredible R&B act that doesn't get their due, just listen to the number of times that they have been sampled, the number of times
So
that
many
people
times.
interpolate their songs.
And also, if you're like DeBarge, that's the big hits were Rhythm of the Night and Who's Holding Donna and All This Love.
Those were the
and
big
I Like
pop
It.
hits.
Yeah.
But there were so many other hits that were big on the R&B chart that didn't cross over before they had that crossover. The problem was,
And we'll do a sample episode where we'll get into that because they have a couple songs that everyone knows. You just don't know you know them.
right. And the problem for them, I feel, became once they had the crossover hits, when they had the Rhythm of the Night album, that's when someone gets in, in L's ear and they're like, hey man, you can go do this thing on your own. And again, takes me back to my whole point. L, you can go off and do your solo stuff, but don't break up the family.
But he had Who's
I
Johnny,
mean-
and then that was it.
And then, look, there were other issues that rose with the family,
There's been a lot of arrests. And
a lot of arrests,
lot of
and
mugshots in that
addiction,
family.
and
Yeah.
things like that. But God, what could have been? What could have been?
So you're harboring resentment at El DeBarge for 40 years for breaking up
Little bit.
DeBarge?
A little bit. And look, he's here in LA, and I might run into him at some point, and
And you'll say, "Oh my God, I love you so much."
I'll have a very open conversation with him about my feelings, but in a respectful way, of course. And who knows? Maybe I'll get DeBarge back together.
Fingers crossed, Charles is going to bring back that DeBarge reunion.
Oh,
Didn't
if
know we
only
needed
I
it.
could. If only I could.
Last one I want to mention, this is you have to end on this line. One of the other bands, Talking Heads, will never get back together. They hate each other. There's issues there. But one of the most acrimonious, bitter splits, the Smiths. People would love to see the Smiths get back together. I'm sure they'd gotten offered so much money over the years. And, Morrissey's had a successful solo career. Johnny Marr was very successful. But it would be
They've
so
never
much
been.
bigger if they got back together. But they hate each other. And the quote that Morrissey had, Morrissey's got all kinds of good quotes. In 2006, he said, "I would rather eat my own testicles than reform the Smiths, and that's saying something for a vegetarian."
You're right. There's no better way to end.
So some bands are not getting back together.
Some are not getting back together, and you know what? That's fine. I don't want them to.
Yeah, it's okay to let them live in your memory, let them live in your record collection, because sometimes you think you want them to get back together, and then you realize,
and
maybe
then you
I
realize that I don't want to hear about Morrissey eating his testicles.
Yeah, they
so it's fine. The
Yeah.
Smiths, just stay where you are.
didn't. His voice is a lot higher when he comes out now.
That is going to do it for us this week on Get to the Hook. We will see you next week.